welcome to the In Transit podcast, a place where we discuss all things supply chain. I'm your host, Vishnu Rajamanikam. In this episode, we are joined by Colby Porter, the lead analytical content manager at Sayari, to discuss how businesses can uncover hidden risks lurking deep within their supply chains. In an era of heightened regulatory scrutiny and fast-moving compliance mandates like the UFLPA, it's no longer enough to just trust your Tier 1 suppliers as a global business. The real risk often lies further upstream, buried in ownership structures, masked by intermediaries, or hidden in opaque trade documents. Colby and I dive into how companies are approaching visibility today, where they're still getting blindsided despite best efforts, and how tools like public records and trade data can help shine a light on the murkiest parts of global supply chain networks. We'll also explore practical ways sourcing teams can use this intelligence, not just for risk avoidance, but to make better sourcing decisions. If you're a business leader looking to move beyond the check-the-box compliance and take real control of your supply chain exposure, then this is for you. So buckle up and let's get started. Hey Colby, welcome to the In Transit podcast.
Hi Vishnu, happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thrilled to have you here. Before we get into the weeds, Colby, give us a quick pitch. What does Sayari do and what's your role in all of it?
Sure. So again, thank you for the opportunity. Sayari, for those who haven't heard of us, we're a leading global risk intelligence provider. And what we do is we collect data records from publicly available and commercially available records worldwide. So we cover over 250 jurisdictions, collecting things like corporate relationships, trade relationships, all in an effort to help customers mitigate regulatory risks, tariff exposure across those jurisdictions, which include high-risk regions such as China and Russia. And so I've been with the company for close to about 3 years now and have worked in a couple of different functions. My background is with the U.S. intelligence community. I worked in anti-money laundering in the private sector. Then I came on board here at Sayari, and I'm currently one of our lead analytical content managers. And so I'm very happy to be speaking with you today.
Brilliant. Let's kick things off with visibility. What are companies doing today to really see what's happening deep in their supply chains, especially when it comes to things like forced labor or illicit activity that's happening downstream?
So, fantastic question. Those laws applying to those issues are only getting more numerous and more demanding of that sort of sub-tier visibility. And where we see newer laws or older laws that are up for revision, they're increasingly adopting some of the same enforcement and reporting requirements that some of the more exacting frameworks out there are already demanding. So that obligation overall is growing more robust, and companies have to confront that situation through a number of different ways. Before, really the best that importers could really do was communicate with their direct or tier 1 suppliers, provide surveys or questionnaires regarding those suppliers' own supply chains, and do things like social audits to make sure that individual facilities or factories were adhering to relevant labor or other laws. Those all still very much apply, of course, but the obligation now applies to those sub-tier or tier and suppliers as well, where those traditional approaches may and often do come up short. So to supplement those compliance operations, there has been this boom in supply chain mapping solutions that take a few different approaches to provide that sort of information that's required to fill those gaps, using things like trade records, which is Sayari's approach, or AI or some other method to pull back the veil, so to speak, on those sub-tier networks. And so the combination of these responses, I think, has really moved from the category where it used to be, where it was simply good practice, proactive approach to this type of risk management. Certainly is very much proactive, but now it's kind of entered the realm of being the expectation, the bare minimum of what companies need to do on these issues.
Got it. Tell me this, Colby, do companies still feel blindsided? Like you mentioned, right? Like they've followed these good practices, they've done the audits, they've followed the rules, but does something still slip through? Or rather, let me flip the question. What are the big blind spots that you see businesses struggling with today, even after taking all these precautions?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because this is still, even years on in some respects for some of this compliance obligation, it's still a question that comes up consistently, how to even begin to approach this. And so, supply chain transparency has kind of become one of those term du jours for the trade compliance community. And I don't think I'm speaking too controversially when I say that absolute transparency, absolute visibility is not really ever going to be fully attainable. It's more a target that moves us toward better compliance and better resiliency than it is an actual objective that we're ever going to actually achieve. So there's inevitably going to be blind spots there. Regular shipment documentation, for one example, remains absolutely critical, but that kind of documentation opens up a number of gaps in the awareness an importer should be shooting for. So what I'm talking about is something like a bill of lading or a packing list or an invoice. With those types of regular documentations, an importer may get a counterparty, their supplier, maybe some information about where that supplier sources their product or components from, but there's not usually much beyond that. Another example of where the traditional approach is no longer going to meet regulatory obligations today or tomorrow. And so if we're looking at the issue of forced labor and compliance with a regulation like the UFLPA, those documents will almost never disclose an origin of Xinjiang, for example, which of course is a surefire indication of forced labor risk under the UFLPA. Xinjiang origin goods are not going to be exported directly from that province. They'll be exported by a company in Shanghai or Guangzhou or Hong Kong, et cetera. But what about those companies' suppliers in country? Or what about a supplier located not in China, but let's say Malaysia or Thailand? What if they source from a Chinese company that presents some form of forced labor risk? That becomes a much trickier problem to solve. So where a company like Sayari seeks to help importers is in supplementing those internal trade records that they may have with publicly available trade and corporate ownership records involving their upstream suppliers. We call this an, quote, outside-in approach to trade compliance, where we can use very authoritative records to validate disclosures by a company's suppliers, and then use shipment activity to map out real-world trade networks of who those suppliers are and their suppliers, and so on and so forth, out to the nth tier of suppliers.
Interesting. You mentioned UFLPA, right? So the trade documents can actually obscure the real risk, right? Like Shanghai shows up on paper, but the inputs come in from Xinjiang, that kind of masking. So where do you even begin to dig this up? Like, how do you start shining a light on those hidden parts of the chain that aren't immediately obvious?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So that's the puzzle to solve there. Absolutely. I think apart from those sub-tier suppliers' own trade records, which can be sourced from country customs agencies, freight forwarders, other actors in the supply chain, we can also use, I mentioned corporate records earlier, we can use those as well. Trade records help us shed light on the international cross-border shipment exchanges that suppliers engage in. They can sometimes provide us insight into shipments internal to a single country, but this is going to be much more rare, and that information is usually much harder to come by, especially in a country like China. So one proxy for that information that we have found to be very effective is in corporate ownership. And so we can use publicly available company registries in China, for example, and begin to draw the shareholding relationships between a supplier and their owner or their downstream subsidiary. These kinds of relationships can and often do suggest trading relationships. So a subsidiary mining raw materials ships those goods to its parent company for further manufacture and then export, for instance. And those relationships, if they tie a supplier to an owner or subsidiary in Xinjiang, those are going to be treated, at least in Sayari solutions, as a risk indicator, but those are also going to be treated as a risk indicator by regulators themselves for forced labor risk. Corporate ownership can be obviously very complex, very opaque, but we can use technical solutions like graph technology, rule-based automation to not only collect the records and parse the data from those records, establishing identifiers of companies and people involved in these relationships and these jurisdictions, but then identify relationships among them, both trade and corporate, and then automate the links based on those, which helps us reveal those non-obvious relationships very quickly, if not instantly.
You mentioned public corporate records of trade filings can expose these hidden subsidiaries or suppliers, right? Like, how does that work in practice, Colby? Let's say a seemingly minor intermediary, maybe not even in the radar, right? Like, they end up being the compliance weak point. Are there any anecdotes that you can share on such scenarios that you've uncovered at Sayari?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you combine all of this data across all of these jurisdictions, it absolutely shines a light on those hidden upstream relationships and suppliers very quickly. And then uncovering those cross-border links between companies becomes a much more critical component of forced labor law compliance because it's all feasible now. A supplier that may initially appear risk-free actually really isn't when you take into account their commercial relationships. And so we see this every day at Sayari. One example that comes immediately to mind was a North American renewable energy company that was fairly well established in the market, but by tapping into Chinese company data records and foreign investment databases, we were able to confirm that that company was ultimately owned by a company in China. Now, there's nothing inherently or immediately illicit about that, not necessarily, but that's an important insight to have if you were doing any sort of due diligence into that North American company as a supplier. And in this case, it actually was a very risky situation because that Chinese company had an ownership chain all of its own. And so we were able to map that ownership chain back to its ultimate owner, which was actually, it turned out, a department of the Chinese government itself. So in effect, you had a North American energy company that had whose ultimate ownership was a Chinese state-owned enterprise, even though it was founded and registered outside that country. And then what was more, that initial Chinese parent company was also a forced labor risk. It actually owned an energy extraction company located in Xinjiang. We flagged that automatically for forced labor risk because, again, it raises the likelihood that its products contain components mined or extracted using forced labor. And all of that was occurring within the energy sector, which is one of the top industries covered by U.S. Customs and their Centers for Excellence and Expertise under the UFLPA and related enforcement. So kind of a complex sort of web of relationships there, but very much actionable from a regulator's standpoint and very much an exposure to risk from a company standpoint. And none of that would have been apparent without corporate and trade records, key identifiers of companies and their subsidiaries involved in this network, and the market intelligence that we work with.
That's pretty fascinating. So you mentioned this North American energy company, right? So what is the consequence of you uncovering this information? Like, what happens to the company or the businesses that work with the company now?
Sure. So we at Sayari, we don't offer sort of consultations or directives on what then to do, but we do provide additional resources for actioning that risk further. So one prime example of that is that because we're collecting so much information, our users are able to conduct what we call alternative supplier analysis. So you decide that a particular upstream supplier is too risky, so you're going to off-ramp that supplier, but you still need to identify some alternative to kind of fill that gap for that particular component or that particular commodity in your overall value chain. And so because from corporate records, a lot of these corporate registries require companies to self-disclose business purposes, the category of industry in which they work. Also, because we're combining that with trade activity, we can validate or kind of doubly confirm that through their own trade activity, what they're importing, what they're exporting. And based off of that, create a list of, hypothetically alternative suppliers that operate in the same industry as the supplier you're off-ramping, trade in the same commodity that you're looking for, but conversely are not flagged for the same kind of risk that you've just uncovered in your existing but soon to be former upstream supplier. And so it's provides more of that end-to-end solution in terms of identifying, but then also mitigating and adjudicating risk.
Makes sense. Let's talk about trust. How do you verify this data? And how confident can companies be that what they're seeing in a trade record or corporate registry is legit?
That's a fantastic question. I'm glad you asked that, Vishnu. Your data is only going to be as good as its sourcing, of course. And that's something that Sayari emphasizes greatly. And because the vast majority of our data are public or publicly available records, we value stressing the ultimate source and provenance of that information. So that kind of raises the question, what do I mean when I say public records? I've kind of touched upon this a little bit, but at a basic level, public records comprise data that's been filed or recorded by a government agency. They typically include corporate registries, procurement data, judicial records, but also trade records as well, just to name a few categories. And public records have several important benefits that speak to your question about trust. And first and foremost, they are actually incredibly reliable. So these records are maintained by government agencies that have a strong incentive to maintain accurate information, because these records are used for a lot of important reasons domestically. So to attract investment, obtain contracts, secure financing, both domestically and in foreign markets. And for that reason, they have to be a single source of truth. And for that reason as well, they're also incredibly authoritative, because they have to serve as that final source of truth on corporate information within their respective jurisdictions. They're also very relevant. They offer rich information on people and companies. They also apply to some of those most important and typically hard to access countries. China, for example, keeps very robust public records. And from that, we are able to pull real world, very authoritative insights into identifiers of particular entities and relationships that they might have amongst one another, but also cross border. And then finally, I think no surprise, as the name suggests, they're public. Now, publicly available doesn't always mean easily accessible, but they are usable for a range of reporting purposes because they're not proprietary records. They're not classified records. And so for that reason, they're available to be accessed and parsed and compiled and then used in, a number of venues. And so for those reasons, public records can provide critical insight into the true nature of our counterparties, whether they're customers, buyers, suppliers. And so at Sayari, we've had incredible success in using this kind of data to help commercial enterprises improve regulatory compliance across a range of issues, but including forced labor. And then additionally, publicly or commercially available trade records that are based on real world shipments. They're not predictive or they're not AI generated or anything like that. Based on real world shipments, provide that documentation with the respective customs agencies in the relevant countries. And so they are also relied upon by customs officials themselves as a source of truth in those trade activities.
Got it. Let's zoom out a bit. I feel that once you get past tier one or tier two suppliers, it kind of gets wild as the complexity explodes, right? How do you even begin to make sense of all of it without drowning in the data, Colby? Would love to hear how Sayari separates the signal from the noise in these massive supply webs.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. We actually recently did an analysis on this and found that among several top auto manufacturers, approximately 95% of all potential risk that we identified resided beyond their tier one suppliers. So what do we do with that? That's a lot to sort through, especially as supply chains naturally balloon out the further upstream we go. And so when handling those incredibly vast networks, there are a few ways that we can begin to denoise all of those potential risks. First is having the ability to specify which risks we care about in the first place, and how critical we choose to consider those risks according to our risk frameworks. By having clearly defined, well-scoped risk management strategies and policies, that provides us the important first step in deciding what matters and what doesn't. So if I'm tasked with UFLPA compliance, for example, I may not care as much about export control risk or some other risk, for example. From there, we have to take the time and nature of trade relationships into account as well. Shipment records provide both the date of arrival for a shipment and the shipment descriptions, along with things like the harmonized system codes, HS codes. And so using these at Sayari, we've created AI-enabled models that allow us to automatically remove those shipments that might lack a relevant time frame. And by that, I mean maybe the shipments occurred before the enactment of the UFLPA. Maybe the shipments upstream occurred after the shipments connecting us to that upstream supply chain. So those shipments won't be relevant for our purposes. Those get removed out. Those models will also account for product type. And this is where HS codes come in. We've designed proprietary product blueprints. They're kind of a likely bill of materials for each HS code and product. And so what that allows us to do then is remove those shipments featuring product categories that are unlikely to serve as components or inputs into what an importer is receiving from their direct supplier. So the time is relevant, the progression through the value chain is relevant, and everything else that doesn't match those criteria are removed from the analysis. And so the result is a supply chain targeted to the risk, the jurisdiction, the product type, and the time frame that matters to a user.
Makes sense. How can knowing more about supplier ownership or upstream material sources actually help a company choose better suppliers? Not just avoid risk, but really make smarter decisions overall.
That's actually a really topical and relevant question, Vishnu. The best practices and lessons learned that we've received after about approximately 3 years of UFLPA enforcement play directly into broader questions about supply chain resiliency, risk management, optimization. Maximizing visibility into those upstream relationships allows companies to proactively identify risk and make decisions to ensure compliance and cost savings. And I think, with the topic that's on everyone's mind, tariffs, as one example, everyone is grappling with the volatility around tariffs. Amid all of that uncertainty, it's all the more important to have reliable, credible information, because that's going to play a role no matter what. Using trade records, we can better ascertain what our supplier or potential supplier's own inputs are, where those inputs come from, and whether that country of ultimate origin is going to expose us to increased duties, for example. So the potential for tariff evasion is likely to grow, and it's likely that the private sector will be obligated to ensure compliance with U.S. tariff policies. And so in order to avoid costly detentions or actions or duty burden, we need to maximize the visibility into the nature and origin of our goods. All the same data points that we've been talking about so far have a role to play in that.
Totally. All right. If I'm a business leader listening in right now, not someone deep in compliance, what's the one thing I should walk away with from this conversation?
I would say that compliance expectations placed upon importers originally for things like forced labor, as I just mentioned, are increasingly essential in ensuring supply chains resiliency and cost effectiveness. The same standards in one now can help companies navigate the complex landscape of tariffs and multiplying regulations that we face today, or the sustainability requirements that major markets like Europe are increasingly demanding for tomorrow. So this approach to import compliance is only going to grow more entrenched, I think, as a necessary feature of broader risk strategy. Now that trade compliance is a top order item for every C-suite, having the confidence and reliability of authoritative records, clear provenance, timely updates are going to be the required risk management items that we all need to consider. And then I'll just conclude by saying that none of this is cost prohibitive. At Sayari, we provide SaaS solutions of our data that can have a single trade compliance professional up and running in minutes, saving time and budget, all while using the same data and platforms that US and European regulators are using. We do partner with them as well. So it's a very easy and quick way to understand where enforcement actions may occur, to do so proactively and in anticipation of the unforeseen developments, and then do so all within a cost-effective solution.
Great. Colby, this is gold. Thank you so much. It was eye-opening stuff for anyone looking to go beyond the check boxes and really take control of their supply chain risk. It was wonderful having you on the show.
Well, Vishnu, I appreciated the exchange. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you.
Thanks again for joining us. And to everyone listening, stay curious, stay vigilant, and we'll catch you in the next episode. This wraps up another episode of the In Transit podcast. To learn more or to hear previous episodes, check out our website at secmr.com/podcast/all or check the podcast segment on thelogisticsreport.com. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.